All right, we're going to do it.
Stop kibitzing.
You ready?
No, but that's never stopped you.
All right. Today, we are going to talk about reading Scripture and the perspective that it is all God's story. So let's talk about that.
You are watching the Beyond Sunday podcast.
Maybe we got the wrong person on the podcast. Apparently, somebody's got something to say off screen over here.
Come on up.
Yeah.
No, I'm just telling you.
She says
As long
it's
as you
wrong.
don't screw it up, this is relevant.
No.
So
I know what you mean.
Hey, good news as we start the episode. Mariah says what we're about to talk about is relevant. Let's see if she still feels that way when we're done.
I'm experiencing more pressure than I should right now because of what you said.
Actually, that surprises me. I can't believe you're actually feeling pressure about anything. But let's go. Let's see what we can do and launch this back off since she's
All right.
derailed us over there.
Come on, delay fish.
It was in the
You
bumper
are
part.
such a delay fish. Well, she says it's in the bumper part. You can never tell anymore. You never
It
can
is
tell.
now. So, all of Scripture is God's story. This is
Okay.
maybe a different idea for a lot of people.
Could be.
I remember, I think late last year,
Okay.
and it's been for me one of those like, duh. This is all the story of God. But
Right.
But I had the realization just on a deeper personal level at the way that all of Scripture interfaces with all of Scripture
Right.
in one grand story. And I think, at least for me, I have for a long time separated it into their own little sections,
Okay.
and you lose the perspective and the fullness of it when you do that.
Right.
And
Right.
so,
Yeah, I think I remember the time that you're thinking about because it was about the same time, same realization. And yeah, when you look at it, I think for any follower of Christ that we get the entire idea that Scripture is God-breathed, that it's inspired by God. Now, I mean, we may vary on how inspiration works and the human interface. There's a lot of theological discussion around that. But I think we get that, you know what, the Bible comes from God, at least as believers. If you're not a follower of Christ, that may be something up for grabs, but, that's something we all get. But it does seem like, okay, so Genesis is about the story of all these different people, and here's how they became the Hebrew nation. And then, Exodus is a story of Moses and how they all went out. And, Samuel is primarily about the story of David. And, then you get into the book of Kings and it's like, here's all this. And then there's Esther and there's all these stories. So the story of Esther is about Esther. But that's not true, actually. And that's what we had talked about. And it was kind of the big idea that's when you say it out loud, you kind of feel like, it's dumb you didn't know that. It's kind of how I felt when we were having this conversation.
yeah, I remember that feeling.
Right, but it was, as we're talking about it, I feel dumb that I'm even saying this out loud, because as we were, and Andrew was with us, we're having this conversation, and we're going, it's all God's story. And you say that, and you feel like you're going to get these eyes looking back at you going, yeah, we know that. That's why we're reading the Bible.
Yeah.
We get that. But it was something different, actually. In all sincerity, it had this profound feeling that this is not Nehemiah's story and Joseph's and Moses' story, that this, from Genesis 1:1 to the end of Revelation, all the way through, this is actually God's story, period.
Yeah, up until this point right now, I have only shared this realization with a trusted group of people for the simple fact that you feel a little dumb when you say it out loud. But now,
So funny.
here I am sharing it with the World Wide Web.
Anybody who wants to know can know that we're dumb.
But it's true, and I think it's fair, just as kind of a sidebar, like there are, as we engage in our faith and walk through, we're just all going to have real revelations at different points.
Yeah.
And it's
that's
not
fair.
that I wouldn't have disagreed if somebody said, well, this is all God's story.
Oh,
It's
no,
like,
not at all.
well, yeah.
Yes.
But then when you really feel it and you have the moment where you're like,
Yeah.
and that was the kind of just aha
Yes.
moment. And it's so interesting, but it's very cool. And it begins to shift the lens that you look through Scripture with.
That's the thing. Yeah.
And I, as I was thinking about this topic, I kind of thought about it like this: when you're getting to know somebody.
Okay.
So as Christians, we desire to know God more and more and more.
Right.
It's how
Should be our desire.
yeah, should be our desire.
Right.
If it's not, that's a great desire.
Yeah.
Go
Start with that.
Go
one.
with that. But when we want to get to know God, we dive into Scripture to get to know God.
Mm-hmm.
But if we just focus on facts, we only get such a small perspective.
Okay.
And so when we're getting to know a new friend, or let's say if I go back and think about the time when I was dating my now wife,
Okay.
when we were getting to know each other, we didn't just exchange facts back and forth. We didn't
Okay.
just share, well, this is how much I weigh, this is how tall I am, this is, if you notice, my eyes are green. We
have
don't
noticed,
just
yeah.
simply beautiful eyes. Okay.
I'll let them judge that. That's fine.
They're beautiful. But
Anyway.
we don't just share facts back and forth.
Right.
We share stories. And
Okay.
you get to know who we are based on all of our stories.
Okay.
And so as I look at the entire picture of Scripture, it is all a collection of stories that lets us know the character and person of God.
There you go. Right.
And it's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. And as I thought about it, even just that idea was like kind of another step forward for me in understanding the richness of it, because as we want to get to know who God is on a deeper level, I want to hear all of your stories, and I want to hear all of the ones even that don't directly talk about you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. When I think back to that moment, I think the realization for me, and I appreciate the word that, we'll all have these, kind of progressive revelations in our life as we go deeper with God, as we learn more about Him, as we allow Christ to have more and more reign and rule in our life. We don't have to be embarrassed about the fact that we understand and we're closer. That should be part of our relationship. So it shouldn't embarrass
Totally.
us. And we should be grace-filled and encourage others into that space instead of going, you just now figured that out? But
That's the truth side we talked about on another episode.
Truth and
It's like,
grace, yeah.
yeah, dummy.
Yeah. Don't do that. That's a bad move forward. But the thing that really hit inside of me, because while we were talking through all this, I'm thinking about a message coming up, and I think if I remember right, it was going to be a message on Nehemiah, I think, at that time. And
Yep, that's
I
right.
had years ago, I think it was, I had looked back, it was like 10 years before I had done a message on Nehemiah. And at that point, looking at that, you go, okay, I'm telling Nehemiah's story. He's this guy. What did he do? And everything else. But then we have this conversation. You go, wait, the sermon that I'm going to do that happens to be on the book of Nehemiah has to be different this time.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I'm going to do is tell God's story. And God is expressing Himself through Nehemiah.
Mm-hmm.
There's something in the life of Nehemiah, what God is doing in his life, around him, some of the truth that's spoken in the circumstances. God is going to show us something about Himself. Yes, it is true we're going to learn something about Nehemiah along the way. But this is God's story. And for me, that was just so huge, because if I start with, this is Nehemiah's story, then it's a little bit like movies. I know you don't grok a whole lot of movie, but in the movie, a lot of times I dropped a word on you. You didn't know. We'll cover that one later.
Okay.
But the thing is that a lot of times we identify with a character in the movie. I want to be like that person, or that person was great. And so there's an identification that comes there. And if we look at Scripture in the same way, you go, oh, Nehemiah is this great guy. I want to be, and you'll even hear believers say, I want to be a Nehemiah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a Joseph, a person who is like this. And it puts our perspective wrong, I think, because now I'm actually settling for a lower standard. If I say, I so want to be a David, I want to be a man after God's own heart. Well, David also, killed people. David was an adulterer. David made a lot of rash mistakes. I don't think I want to be all of David. And not to mention, if David's my goal, then I'm aiming short. Our goal is to be like Christ. But if I look at the story that this is David's story, I could end up fooling myself into accepting a lesser than something that's even greater.
Yeah, and so I love the example of David because we focus on the great part about him,
Right.
But the rest of who he is actually a better image of who God is.
Okay.
When you
All right,
look
hit me with
at
that.
his story and the whole story, all of the sin, all of the horrible things that he's done that we don't want any part of.
Hopefully not.
We just want the successful side of it.
Right.
But everybody's story through Scripture is a testimony to who God is in a different way.
Okay.
We are no different than that. So when we make testimony in our own lives for the sake of who God is and why he is worth committing your entire life to,
Right.
when we share with people, we are just in today's age people through Scripture, and we allow who God is to be from our story. And so it is really just recognizing that their times were different, situation was different, but
Sure.
they are people
They are.
just like I am people, person, whatever.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And my story is to be a reflection of who God is.
Right.
And so it's the same as we look at anybody through Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same story. They're all making testimony. The focal point isn't on the person, really.
Okay. Yeah, and I agree. As I'm, again, this sounds silly, but with that perspective in mind, carrying that perspective every time you start reading through the Bible. Like right now, as a church family, we're all reading through the Bible in a year. It's kind of one of the things that we do every year. And right now we're in the book of Numbers. And it's very easy to go, okay, the book of Numbers, a lot of rules in here. You see some movement of the people as they're wandering through the wilderness for 40 years. So look at them. Look at how foolish they are, when they've rebelled over here, they've complained over here. God's laying out all these rules over here. And so there is a lot of fact, a lot of information in here, and you go, okay, here's this deal. But if I step back and I go, okay, let me dive back into this, but I need to understand this is God's story. That when I dive back into it, I begin to interpret Scripture different, and I receive something different because I'm starting with the right foot forward. And you think, well, it shouldn't make that much of a difference. They're still the exact same words, but the perspective shifts everything.
That's a big difference.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here and I'm saying, okay, this is God's story. So what is he doing? Not what are the people doing, but what is he doing? And you see, well, how faithful he is.
That's right.
He provides all the way through. How gracious he is. And so we've talked previously about truth and grace. He never changes his stance on anything. But yet, as they fail, as they fall down, as they rebel, we see grace come in over here. So he's demonstrating truth and grace. He's demonstrating, again, his faithfulness all the way through. And he's showing how he's willing to walk through and work with a people because he's got a big plan. In this moment, you're looking at this going, I don't even know what your plan is because I can't fathom it. And you go, well, that's why you got to pay attention to my whole story because I've got more to come and all this is about to fall into place. And so, for me, as I begin to read and interpret Scripture, sometimes you can hit one of those verses. It's really hard and you go, well, that's a really tough one. But as you realize it's all God's story, and so you can pull back and start looking at the entirety of Scripture and it starts to find its place, and you can see where it fits into the bigger story then.
Yeah. When we see and read Scripture through the lens of all of it being God's story, I think it allows us a better opportunity to place ourselves in Scripture
Okay.
and to see God in our daily lives. So when I think about the story of the Israelites,
Okay.
it goes on and on and on, and you're like, why don't you all just do the right thing here? Like,
Right.
and you're like commentating from the sidelines, like, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. No, just do the thing.
Right.
But I'll take a step back, place my own life in that. How many times have I done the exact same thing?
Okay. Yeah.
And it's all God's story of being faithful and consistent and gracious, even when we are disobedient.
Right.
Well, I'm no different than that.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I can look back and I have done all of those things. I wasn't wandering in the wilderness,
Right.
literally,
Right.
but I was. There was time where I was choosing disobedience, where I was doing my own thing. I cared about what I cared about. And the Lord was gracious enough to be consistent with me and faithful until I recognized, oh, man, I know what you're doing.
Right.
Or I finally see it different.
Yeah. And I've had those conversations where in, a Bible study or something like that, we're all sitting around talking and you see something going on in the Old Testament and you go, what a bunch of ninnies. I can't believe they did that. I mean, there's a pillar of fire in front of you and you go, I don't think God knows what he's doing. Pillar of fire, man. It's right there. and we go, from our life, we go, well, if I had a sign like that, I wouldn't have messed up or anything else. And so when we start looking at the people and things, again, we're used to movies and literature, and we begin judging characters in this way. But the characters, the human characters in the story, aren't the actual focus. So God's telling his story and his interaction with humanity, all of us. It's like you could, take any one of the Israelites, like a little while back we read about Korah's rebellion. You could take Korah and put, Norm in there, and this is Norm's rebellion. And you go, well, I wouldn't have done that. Well, in the, kind of eternal scheme of things, you really kind of have. Yeah, I wasn't literally there. I haven't literally done that. But am I not so very similar to him? And, God's showing us that humanity is like this, and yet he is also who he is all the way through. And that's the cool thing is when you begin to look at it as his story all the way through, I've been in places where I've talked with people and they've said, man, I am so glad that Jesus came. You go, well, yeah, true. But I hear something going on in that. What's the deal? Well, I'm so glad he came because, God, when you read about him in the Old Testament, that guy was mean. And you go, same guy. It's the same guy all the way through. But the thing is if you're just looking at characters and you're assuming God is another figure interacting in this person's story, and here's Jesus, a different guy interacting in this story here, same guy. That when you actually bring it down to, no, this is God's story all the way through, and you can actually pull back and you look and see what he's doing, you get to see his nature so much better all the way through.
All of who he is, not just a narrow idea of, we allow God to be some of the things that we feel like we need most at times.
Okay, yeah.
So, for certain people, depending on our wiring, we see God more through a lens, and we have difficulty digesting the character of God in other parts of Scripture because,
yeah, that's fair.
Well, God is love.
Right.
Yes, he is.
Yes.
God is justice. I don't like that one.
He is that too.
But he's that. And so we get a grander picture and a better image of how vast and mighty and strong and gracious and gentle God is. And it's just so much more than what we tend to allow ourselves to understand, speaking only from my own experience.
Right.
And there's just such vastness around God that we may never comprehend fully all of it.
Right.
But I got a lot more time on this earth, God willing, and there's so much in Scripture.
Right.
I want to continue to figure it out. I want more and more and more understanding and knowledge of character and who he is.
So if we're going to give somebody a piece of advice and say, as you pick up the Bible today and you're going to dive into it, whether it's devotionally or you're going to read through it or however it is you're going to approach it, and you want to have this perspective, what would you say? Here's a great piece of advice to just step forward and kind of to change your thinking and how you can begin absorbing Scripture. What would you say?
I think a great practice is as you begin reading stories throughout Scripture, even just asking yourself certain questions and pondering them and allowing yourself to answer, where do I see the person of Jesus, the person of God in this story? Allow yourself to look at themes through a story, not just necessarily the person. Because in my own life, I don't want my person to be glorified. I want God's story to be glorified. Same is true as we read it in Scripture.
That's good.
And so, allow yourself to ask questions. Where do I see God in this? Where do I see the character of God in this? And some of them are more in front of you. Some of them you feel like you have to dig and understand more. But ask those questions and simply then invite the Lord to just bring understanding and bring wisdom. We have, again, a long time to continue to study and seek and learn. And so be patient with yourselves, but be curious about reading through Scripture and understanding. So I think this has been a great conversation. Keep the conversation going in the comments if you have questions or thoughts. We'd love to engage with you. But for now, that's what we know.
This has been another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.